Has anyone in your family ever planted a specific herb at the gate of the compound? Not a garden, not decoration. A specific plant, at the boundary, at the entrance, at the point where the outside meets the inside, or placed a fragrant plant near the front door of the house. Something green, something aromatic, without being able to explain exactly why. Ask Grace. She knows. Her grandmother did this. She planted 3 things at the corners of the compound fence. African basil at the gate, a bitter herb along the back wall, something fragrant she called by an Igbo name that Grace never learned to translate. Grace grew up watching this and filed it away as grandmother tradition, village custom, something from an older world that had not fully arrived in the city. She never asked why, and nobody told her. What I want to show you tonight is what I found in the British Museum reading room when I was trying to answer a question about Leviticus 14. And why, when I opened a letter my mother had written me 20 years before, I understood that the answer had been sitting in my own family all along. Your grandmother's herbs were not tradition, they were architecture, and the architect was Solomon. Let me begin with the text that started all of this. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 33. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. Most scholars read this verse as evidence of Solomon's intellectual curiosity, a polymathic king who catalogued the natural world as part of his extraordinary wisdom, an ancient botanist. I am not sure that reading survives serious examination. The context of this verse is not a chapter about Solomon's library or his academic interests. It is a chapter about his authority. Verse 31 tells us his wisdom surpassed that of all the people of the East and of Egypt. Verse 32 records that he spoke 3,000 proverbs. Verse 33 continues, he spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also spoke about animals and birds and reptiles and fish, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. That phrase has a structure. It is not a random list. It is a spectrum. From the largest living thing known to Solomon's world, the cedar, the magnificent tree of Lebanon, whose timber was so prized that Solomon imported it in rafts across the sea to build the temple, to the smallest, hyssop, a low aromatic herb that grows in the cracks of stone walls, so humble it requires no cultivation at all. Solomon spoke about the entire plant kingdom, from its greatest to its most modest. And he spoke about it with the same category of authority, wisdom surpassing all peoples, that governed everything else he knew. Now here is the question that sent me to Leviticus 14. Why those 2 plants specifically? Of all the plants in the ancient Near Eastern world, the text anchors the spectrum at exactly those 2 points. Cedar at one end, hyssop at the other. Why? I pulled out the Leviticus concordance. Leviticus chapter 14 verse 4. The priest shall order that 2 live clean birds and some cedar wood and scarlet yarn and hyssop be brought for the person to be cleansed. Cedar wood, hyssop, together, in the same ritual bundle. This is the Leviticus 14 ritual, the procedure for cleansing a person from tzarath, the most severe form of spiritual contamination in the Torah, the condition associated with divine punishment, with occultic corruption, with the kind of defilement that required complete separation from the community until cleansing was performed. And the cleansing formula specified by God contains cedar and hyssop, the same 2 plants that anchor Solomon's botanical catalogue. But I want you to notice something else in that formula. Verse 4 lists cedar wood, hyssop, scarlet yarn, 3 elements, bound together, dipped together in the blood of a slaughtered bird over running water, and then used to sprinkle the contaminated person 7 times. 3 elements, cedar, hyssop, scarlet thread. The same 3-element formula appears again in verse 49, to purify the house, not the person. The house itself, a house that has been spiritually contaminated, a dwelling infected with the same category of defilement. God prescribes exactly the same bundle, cedar wood, hyssop, scarlet yarn. Take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet yarn and dip them into the blood of the dead bird and the fresh water and sprinkle the house 7 times. A contaminated house is cleansed with the same three elements as a contaminated person: cedar, hyssop, scarlet thread. Now sit with what I've just shown you. The two plants that anchor Solomon's botanical spectrum in 1 Kings 4 are the same two plants God specified in Leviticus 14 as the primary elements of the most powerful spiritual cleansing ritual in the Torah. Solomon did not catalogue plants out of academic curiosity. He catalogued a weapons inventory. He knew which plants God had encoded as spiritual barriers. He knew their doctrinal basis, their legal standing in the covenant system, their function in the architecture of spiritual protection. From the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls, from the most powerful to the most accessible. He knew every point on the spectrum. And then he went home and built it. Let me show you what Solomon's house actually was. Not what it looked like, what it was. 1 Kings, chapter 7, verse 2. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon 100 cubits long, 50 wide and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. The palace of the forest of Lebanon, named for its material, built from cedars, cedar columns, cedar beams, cedar lining on the walls, cedar ceiling, cedar floor. Solomon's own house was built of the first element in the Leviticus 14 purification bundle. He did not build a house and then perform a cedar ritual inside it. He built his house out of cedar. The house itself was the first element, assembled in timber, standing as a three-dimensional expression of Leviticus 14's primary material. Now go back to 1 Kings 4, verse 33. The hyssop that grows out of walls, not planted in a garden, not cultivated in a formal bed. Out of walls. Solomon described the hyssop growing out of walls as a specific observation, not a general botanical note. The Masoretic Hebrew uses the word yotze, coming out from, springing out of. The hyssop springs out of the wall. In the Palestinian environment of the Solomonic period, the most common hyssop-adjacent species was Origanum syriacum, Syrian marjoram, also known as za'atar. This plant grows wild in stone walls in the Levant. It requires no cultivation. It seeds itself in the cracks of stone. It grows precisely where Solomon described it, out of walls. Solomon built his own compound from cedar. He grew the second element of Leviticus 14 from the very walls of that compound. He had not built a house with a protection ritual inside it. He had built his house as the protection ritual, the ritual assembled in timber and in living root. His compound boundaries were cedarwood. His compound walls grew hyssop, the first two elements of God's own spiritual cleansing formula, prescribed in Leviticus, maintained in the temple, understood by Solomon with a precision no one else in his generation possessed, were built and grown into the architecture of his home. This is not coincidence. This is doctrine in stone and root, and it is available to you. Now I need to take you into the function of each plant specifically, because it is not enough to know they appear in the ritual. Solomon knew why they were there. In Hebrew, hyssop is ezov. When you trace every appearance of ezov through the Hebrew scriptures, one pattern emerges, so consistent I do not see how any serious reader could call it coincidental. Ezov appears at the threshold, not inside the house, not at the center of the sacred space. At the threshold, Exodus chapter 12, verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and on both sides of the doorframe. Doorframe. The hyssop is the instrument used to mark the boundary between the protected space and the destroying angel, not applied to the floor, not to the walls of the room, to the doorframe, the exact point where outside becomes inside. Numbers chapter 19, verse 18. A person who is ceremonially clean is to take some hyssop, dip it in the water, and sprinkle the tent and all the furnishings and the people who were there. The purification rite for contact with death uses hyssop as the application instrument. Psalm 51, verse 7. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. David, in the most intimate confession in the Psalms, does not ask for generic spiritual cleansing. He names the instrument, hyssop. Every use of hyssop in the Hebrew scriptures does one thing. It creates a boundary between the clean and the contaminated, between the living and the dead, between the protected space and what seeks to cross into it. Hyssop is the plant of the threshold. It marks and defends the point where worlds meet. When Solomon observed hyssop growing out of walls, out of the very surface that forms the boundary of a compound, he was not making a natural history note. He was describing the threshold plant growing precisely where the threshold is, at the boundary between what is inside and what seeks to come in exactly the location where its spiritual function is architecturally expressed. Now, cedar. Cedar is the opposite movement. If hyssop marks the threshold, the point where the outside meets the inside, cedar establishes what the inside is. The Hebrew word is erez. In Leviticus 14's bundle, cedar represents incorruptibility. Cedar does not decay. Cedar resists rot. Cedar holds its fragrance for generations. A cedar chest made 3,000 years ago still smells of cedar today. What cannot be corrupted cannot be contaminated. When God specified cedar as part of the purification bundle, he was not adding an ingredient with pleasant aromatic properties. He was adding the material that represents, in the physical world, the property of divine permanence. The incorruptible presence of God, the Shekinah that does not decay. In Egyptian practice, cedarwood oil was used in mummification to prevent physical corruption after death. In Mesopotamian ritual fumigation, cedarwood smoke was used to cleanse sacred spaces before divine encounter. The cross-cultural consensus across the ancient Near East is consistent. Cedar is what refuses to yield. Cedar is permanence. When Solomon built his house of cedar and lined the temple walls in cedar, 1 Kings 6 verses 15 through 18, he was not making an architectural choice about timber quality. He was installing permanence. He was saying, in timber, what God has established here will not decay. It will not be contaminated. It will not yield to what would corrupt it. The walls of Solomon's house were cedar because permanence is a form of protection. What cannot be corrupted will not be corrupted. Now the third element, Leviticus 14's bundle, includes cedar, hyssop, and the scarlet thread. The third element in the formula is crimson yarn, shani, sometimes translated scarlet. But the third plant, the aromatic boundary herb that completes the compound system, is answered by both the Mishnah and by West African household tradition. The Mishnah, in Tractate Parah, lists multiple aromatic herbs that qualify as ezov for the ritual. The common property, strong aromatic presence, wall-growing habit, threshold placement. In Yoruba tradition, the protective herb placed at compound boundaries is ephyrin, African basil, Ocimum gratissimum, placed at the gate, at the corners, at the threshold, not inside the compound, at the boundary. In Ghana, specific aromatic herbs are maintained at the four corners of the family compound, specifically to block what Akan tradition calls malevolent spiritual intrusion. Not planted in a central garden, at the boundary corners, precisely at the points corresponding to the temple's perimeter. The aromatic compounds in these plants, thymol carvacrol found in za'atar, marjoram, African basil, and related species, were apparently discovered independently in multiple cultures to serve the same boundary function, or they were not discovered independently at all. They were preserved from a common source, through the generations of people who maintained the knowledge through practice when the library was unavailable. Your grandmother's ephyrin at the compound gate was not folk medicine. It was the third element of Solomon's boundary protocol. The practice survived. The knowledge traveled without the library, because the plants grow wherever the people go. Let me tell you about the British Museum reading room. I was in my mid-40s, working on what would become a conference paper on ritual contamination in Second Temple Judaism. Specifically, the question of why the Leviticus 14 purification formula for a house uses the same three-element bundle as the formula for a person. The Mishnah has extensive discussion of both applications. I have the Leviticus 14 passage in Hebrew. I had the Mishnah commentary beside it. I had a reference work on Palestinian flora open to the entry on Origanum syriacum. And in the folder that I carry to research sessions, a worn leather folder that I've used since my doctoral work at SOAS, and that still has the coffee ring from a night in the reading room in 1998, I had a letter. My mother wrote it when I first left for London. I was 19, she was in the Sukkah. She had never been to England, and she did not know when she would see me again. She wrote partly in English and partly in Igbo. She always slipped into Igbo when she was saying something she did not want my father to read easily. He was British, an academic, a man of careful, rational arguments. Some things she said only in Igbo. I had carried the letter for 20 years without fully reading the Igbo sections. My Igbo was functional, but imperfect. I kept meaning to have a cousin translate the parts I could not fully parse. That afternoon in the British Museum, with Leviticus 14 in front of me and the reference work on Palestinian flora open, I took out the letter. I do not know why. Something about the reading, about the compound cleansing passage, the hyssop that grows out of walls, made me think of her. She described what she did to the compound before I left. She planted 3 things at the compound gate. She named them in Igbo. I could read 2 of the names. One was Osu, a plant I recognized, a protective herb used in Igbo household tradition. The other was Ephyrin, the same African basil I was reading about in the ethnobotanical footnotes of the Mishnah reference work. The same aromatic threshold plant documented in Yoruba and Igbo compound protection practice. The third name I could not translate from the Igbo alone. I set the letter beside the open reference work. I sat for a long time. I did not need the reference work for the third plant. My mother had planted what she knew, what her mother had taught her, and her mother before that. 3 things at the compound gate. The same category of plant, the same placement, the same intention. She had not read Leviticus 14. She had sent me to London carrying knowledge that Leviticus 14 confirms. The source text had been in the British Museum reading room. She had been applying it in Sukkah for her entire life, before her son was born. I want to take you now to the Song of Solomon, because there is a passage in that book I think has been misread for centuries. Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 12. You are a garden locked up, my sister, my bride. You are a spring enclosed, a sealed fountain. The Persian concept behind this image is paradisa, the enclosed garden, the walled space, the word from which we derive paradise. Paradisa is not a metaphor for beauty. It is a specific architectural form, a walled enclosure protected precisely because of what surrounds it. A locked garden is not locked because the owner is possessive. It is locked because the boundary defines and protects what is inside. Now read verse 13. Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates with choice fruits, with henna and nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with every kind of incense tree, with myrrh and aloes and all the finest spices. Every plant in that list is aromatic. Every plant carries strong, persistent fragrance, the same category as Leviticus 14's purification bundle, the same category that Yoruba and Igbo traditions maintain at compound boundaries. Solomon's locked garden is not a love poem's embellishment. It is a botanical theology. What you plant at the boundary determines what cannot cross it. Remove the aromatic boundary, open the walls, and the garden is simply ground. The boundary is defined by what you grow at it, and what you grow at the boundary determines what the space inside becomes. Now let me take you to the practical architecture, because that is the promise the title makes. 3 plants, where to put them, why they work. But I will not give you the steps without the doctrine beneath them, because arriving at the right plants without understanding why you are planting them is less than Solomon intended. The first plant is hyssop, or its regional equivalent. If you can find true hyssop, use it. In West Africa or the African diaspora, Ephyrin, African basil. In the Middle East, za'atar. Anywhere, any strongly aromatic herb in the marjoram, basil, oregano family carries the threshold property. Plant it at your front entrance, not inside the house, at the point where outside becomes inside. An apartment? A pot of African basil just inside the front door serves the same function. This is the Ezov of Exodus 12. The plant used to apply the Passover blood to the doorframe, the threshold herb, the boundary marker. Water it while speaking. Numbers 19, verse 18 aloud. Not in your mind. Aloud. The verse, a man who is clean shall take some hyssop, dip it in the water and sprinkle the tent and all the furnishings and the people who were there. You are doing what Solomon built into his compound walls. The second plant is cedar. Very few people can grow a Lebanese cedar. You do not need the full tree. Cedarwood chips placed at the back entrance serve the same boundary function. Cedar essential oil on a cloth near the back door. A small cedar wood block on the back windowsill. Hyssop at the front, cedar at the back. The house is sealed front to back with Leviticus 14's two primary elements. Cedarwood incense burned in the home once a week renews the boundary. The third plant is the one your family already has. If you come from a West African household, Igbo, Yoruba, Ghanaian, the third plant is what your grandmother planted at the compound boundary. The fragrant herb your elders maintained at the four corners of the fence. The one that was always there and seemed to belong to the boundary itself. In Yoruba tradition, Efirin. In Igbo tradition, the Ozu. In Ghanaian Akan tradition, the aromatic species kept at corner points. If your grandmother planted lavender or rosemary or sage at the garden edges, that is your third plant. Place it at the side boundary of your property or at the side window of your apartment. Three elements, surrounding the space, not defending from within, surrounding. This is what Solomon built. A compound surrounded by Leviticus 14's primary elements. Not a house with a ritual performed inside it. A house that was the ritual. When you first place each element, speak this aloud. I cleanse this house, its walls, its entrances, every point where the outside meets the inside, by the authority that God gave Solomon over every plant from cedar to hyssop. What enters here has been tested. What is unclean cannot cross, not incantation. Architecture with voice. The hyssop knows why it is planted there when you tell it. Or more precisely, you know why it is planted there when you say it aloud. And the act of knowing, the act of naming what you are doing and why, is what transforms arrangement into architecture. I want to bring this together with something I find impossible to look past. The Leviticus 14 cleansing ritual, cedar, hyssop, scarlet thread, is used for exactly two purposes in the Torah. The first, cleansing a person from Zarath. The second, cleansing a house from Zarath. Zarath is translated as leprosy, but that is imprecise. Zarath in the Torah is associated with divine punishment for serious spiritual violations. Miriam received it for speaking against Moses. Gehazi received it for deception against Elisha. Uzziah received it for entering the temple with priestly authority he did not have. These are not dermatological cases. They are cases of spiritual contamination. The condition spreads. It appears on walls, on fabric, on the person. And the formula God prescribed, cedar, hyssop applied to the boundary, is used for both the contaminated person and the contaminated house. Because in the operating logic of Leviticus, the person and the house share the same spiritual environment. What contaminates one contaminates both. What cleanses one can cleanse both. What Solomon built into his compound was not post-incident cleansing. It was preemptive boundary maintenance. He did not wait for the contamination to enter and then apply the formula. He built the formula into the structure so that the contamination could not enter in the first place. Most of us think of spiritual protection as response. Something went wrong. Apply the remedy. Solomon thought of it as architecture. His house was built of cedar. Hyssop grew from its walls. The boundary was the ritual, always active, not waiting to be called upon. Already there. Now I want to show you one more thing, and this one I find genuinely difficult to look past. The practice Solomon established in his compound survived, not in archives, not in manuscripts requiring specialists, in gardens, in the hands of women who planted specific herbs at specific corners of specific compounds, women who could not have read 1 Kings 4 or Leviticus 14, because the institutional church that held the books chose to preach from other passages. And the knowledge that the boundary herb was doctrinal rather than traditional was quietly set aside somewhere between Solomon's palace of the Forest of Lebanon and the 20th century. The knowledge survived in practice, because practice survives censorship more easily than doctrine. Among the African diaspora in the Americas, the hoodoo and rootwork traditions maintained specific herb combinations at house boundaries, consistently including hyssop and cedarwood. These traditions traveled across the Atlantic without a library, without Leviticus, without 1 Kings, with the plants, and with the knowledge that specific plants placed at the boundary block what seeks to enter from outside. The knowledge never said, "This is from Leviticus 14." It said, "This is what you plant at the gate." Your grandmother, who maintained African basil at the compound corners, did not know she was doing what Solomon did. But Solomon would have recognized immediately what she was doing. And he would have felt something, I believe this, that I felt sitting in the British Museum with my mother's letter, beside the Mishnah reference work. The recognition that the knowledge had been held, that it had been carried, that it had arrived across 3,000 years of silence and diaspora at the compound gate of a woman in Nigeria who could not have named its source, but could name its purpose. Protection for her family from what sought to cross the boundary. Let me leave you with something different from what I usually give. Not instruction, not commissioning. I want you to look at your compound with new eyes, or your front door, or your windowsill, and ask yourself, what grows here? What has always grown here? What did someone plant at this boundary, at this exact point where outside becomes inside, that you have passed without thinking about for years? If something is already growing there, if there was a plant your grandmother placed or that appeared on its own at the threshold, ask the person who knows your family's history what it is. You may find you already have the first element. You may already have the third. The cedar at the back, the permanence, the incorruptibility, is what you add. You are not starting from nothing. You are completing what someone in your family already began. 3,000 years ago, a king in Jerusalem caused hyssop to grow from his walls. He built his palace from cedar. He knew the spectrum from cedar to hyssop because he had read Leviticus 14 with the same precision that he read everything else, not as piety, not as tradition, but as tactical knowledge, as architecture. He went home and built it. You already know what to plant, now you know why it works. The compound your grandmother maintained, the herbs at the gate, the fragrant plant your family has kept at the boundary for as long as anyone can remember without being able to explain why. That was Solomon, working through your grandmother's hands. 3,000 years before you found this. You do not need a new practice. You need to look with new eyes at the one that was already there. Go and look at your gate. The plants that belong there already know what they are for.